Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We are glad to have you here for this week's History's Lunch. My name is Drew Gardner with the two Mississippi Museums, and we are glad to have you in our home, the Craig H. Neilsen Auditorium, here in the Museum of Mississippi History and the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. Our program is also streaming live on both Facebook and YouTube, where you can find any of our previous History's Lunch programs at any time. We hope that you'll consider joining us this Friday, November 7th at 10:30 for our annual Veterans Day program. This program will take place on the Entergy Plaza just in front of the two Mississippi Museums as we honor and recognize our both past and current veterans. But today we are very excited to welcome both Tammy Mielke and Michelle Martin in a conversation with our Director of Museum Education, Jasmine Holmes, celebrating the works of author Mildred Taylor. Tammy is an English language arts teacher and academic whose research focuses on the way that culture is represented in literature intended for children and young adults. Her previous publications include a history of illustrations on Little Black Sambo and responses to African American dialect and children's literature in the 1930s. Michelle Martin is the Beverly Cleary Endowed Professor in Children and Youth Services at the University of Washington. Her current research project, Dream Keepers for Children of the Sun, is a critical analysis of the collaborative and individual works that Langston Hughes and Arna Bontemps wrote for children during their 40-year friendship. And then Jasmine Holmes, in addition to her role as the Director of Museum Education here at the two Mississippi Museums, she's also an award-winning author. For those of you who don't know, she has over 10 published works, including one that's coming out this June called Our Sister's Keeper. That'll be out. We'll have more about that later on. But please give a round of applause as we welcome Tammy Mielke, Michelle Martin, and Jasmine Holmes to the stage.
Good morning. Can y'all hear me?
Good
Is it
morning.
on? It's good? Okay. I'm so excited to be talking to you two this morning. When we had our conversation on the phone, there it is. We had our conversation on the phone before kind of coming here for this. I told y'all that Mildred D. Taylor is really, really important to me. I would say that like Mildred D. Taylor's work and Addie, the American Girl are they comprise who I am as a person. And going through this work was really meaningful for me. So thank you so much for editing it, first off.
Thank you for reading it. We told Jasmine we hadn't met anybody yet who's actually read it, so we're excited about that.
I read it. I was showing y'all my sticker. I read it. I loved it. Before we get started, I know there was something that you wanted to share.
So we decided that that some poetry really needed to be in the anthology, so it begins with 2 poems. And I reached out to the poets last night and said, hey, would y'all give me a reading of your poems? So this one is an Ariki for Mildred Taylor by Y. Falami DeVoe.
An Ariki for Mildred by Y. Falami DeVoe. Ariki, a Yoruba praise poem spoken or sung in praise of an individual. The gifted griot of the House of Taylor anoints, awakens, readers, listeners, bringing forth light in darkness. The gifted griot of the House of Taylor, bodaciously beckoning readers, listeners, to peer into the lens of racial injustice. The gifted griot of the House of Taylor, dame of diction, protector of the past, ambassador of the ancestors, benefactress of stories, conjurer of consciousness. The gifted griot of the House of Taylor, purposeful with the pen, Mississippi memory keeper, meritable medal holder, planting messages of dignity, hope, unity, pride.
right, we're going to end with the other one, I think. But, yeah.
I brought my questions, so I'll stay on topic and not be gushy. The first question I have is about the first chapter of the book, which was actually my favorite chapter, the idea of what the stories that silence can tell us. How does silence function as both survival and resistance throughout Taylor's work?
So we decided to put Latrice Ferguson's article first, or chapter first, because she talks about the way that silence plays such a key role in Mildred Taylor's works. And some of the examples, well, she starts out by saying, my grandmother, she narrated 2 sentences that she knew about her grandmother's history. And she said, that is all my grandmother would say. And I have tried to get more information out of her, but there was such shame about where she had come from that she refused to say anything more. So basically, Latrice said, the way that I filled in those gaps, no, it wasn't my family, but I read Taylor's work, and it helped me to sort of understand what my grandmother may have, some of the things that she and her ancestors have gone through. And so she looks at silences like the fact that when Cassie in Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry gets slapped off the sidewalk by Mr. Sims because Cassie bumps into his white daughter, Lillian Jean Sims, and she doesn't want to apologize, and Mr. Sims makes her apologize after he smacks her off the sidewalk. And then Big Ma, her grandma, comes, and Cassie is incensed that grandma makes her apologize and makes her call this white girl Ms. Lillian Jean. And so when they get home, it's not Big Ma who sits her down and says, this is why I did this to keep you safe. It's Mama who has that conversation with her. So there's this silence around that. When Mama gets fired from her job at the school at Great Faith Elementary, it's not Ma who says, I lost my job, I'm hurt. It's Dad who explains, your mama's been wanting to be a teacher since she was a little bitty thing, and so this is going to hurt her. It's going to hurt her bad. Mama doesn't talk about that. And so Latrice talks about so many ways that the silences, especially around women, when Cassie in the last book is at the OBGYN's office, and this white man is basically telling her, assume the position. All black women know how to get spread your legs, because he just assumes that she is promiscuous, and she ends up walking out. But she doesn't tell anybody. She ends up telling her sister-in-law Dee later, but it's so many silences that really play throughout, and you have to sort of navigate through those silences throughout the book. So it's also one of a really strongly written chapter. So it was a great one to kind of start with.
And I would say that silence is a bit of a theme that we see throughout a lot of the chapters in the collection, partly because I think what Taylor does so well in the entire series is she's pointing out that there are silences in history. And if we don't acknowledge that there are silences in history, then we're missing what history really is. And so, and that comes through in a lot of different ways. Song of the Trees is one of the books in which Cassie as a character is, in a sense, asking the trees to speak to her, to give her information, and the trees remain silent. And it's a later chapter, but that particular author talks about how if we don't stop and listen to the silence, then we're missing the bigger picture.
When I read the chapter, I hadn't remembered that Mama was fired from her teaching job for teaching history. And it was so interesting as somebody who'd grown up reading Mildred D. Taylor, but was looking at it from Cassie's perspective. It was really interesting to see kind of my story in Mama's perspective of, not being fired, but in that Mississippi way of we're gonna make it really hostile for you to be here until you leave. Yeah. And so talk to me a little bit about kind of y'all's experience with opening up that silence and the consequences that have come from it.
Yeah, I've been an academic for a little over 30 years now, but one of my very first student evaluations at Clemson University was, actually I started my career at Stephen F. Austin State University at Nacogdoches, Texas, but it was one of those first few years that I had a student who wrote, "I appreciate all of this multicultural literature, but there is real literature too." Those are one of those things that you really don't forget. I also had a student who was sort of hostile about, why do we have to read all of this diverse literature? I'm getting ready to go teach and she named this town that people had told me just outside of Houston, Nacogdoches in the area, was a sundown town. Don't be caught after dark in this town. And she said, I'm gonna go teach in whatever the name of this town was, so I don't need these books. I said, honey, you need them more than anybody else in here, because literature can take you places where you and your students might never go. And so, really trying to help expand her mind about that. And I think, Tammy has also, been in academia where we are teaching the generation who are going to be the next teachers or the next librarians. And if students often don't teach what they don't know, right? They sort of drop back to what was in their teacher ed programs or what was in the library programs, and that's what they recommend or that's what they teach. And so I feel like it's my responsibility as somebody in higher ed to expose people to as much of that as I can, because that's what I want to be what they reach for and what's most familiar. Because we've all had a huge dose of the literary canon that tends to be very white and very male, but a whole lot of other stuff is being written that I think is, really valuable. So did I stay on task, Jasmine? Okay.
That was great.
As a white woman, I've had some different issues in academia just about being female. Michelle and I were talking about this earlier, and I once had a student who came up to ask me a question at the end of class, and the question was, do you think I have pink eye in my eye? I'm like, why are you asking me that, right? So it's a very gendered place as well, which is something to think about with Cassie's position in the book, that she is not only African American, she is also a young girl. And so she's sort of at the bottom of the ladder in terms of power and position at that point in time, and she has to work to overcome that. I did have a student once, while you were speaking, I thought about this. The lack of knowledge that exists in college students is a little scary at times. I had a student once tell me that the civil rights movement didn't actually happen. I encouraged that student to not be an educator quite strongly. You need to, major in something else. Go to business, do something. But it's kind of surprising when we bring these books into the college classroom, the responses of people are like, I never knew that. Later question, we'll talk a little bit about what happens in the classroom. One of the chapters later in the book is a comparison of the book that I'm To Kill a Mockingbird. Thank you, just out of my head. And in the school that I'm presently teaching in, the 8th graders cover that book in their curriculum. So as the 7th grade teacher, I make sure that we cover Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry first, to get that history in first before they get to 8th grade.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, now I want to talk about To Kill a Mockingbird. I, in the past, have written, I had a, people come up to you as a teacher, especially a teacher of color, and be like, what's something that we can read to learn about this period of time? And they think they have it covered when they have To Kill a Mockingbird, right? They're like, I don't need any advice on what to read about the racism, because I've already got that in To Kill a Mockingbird. What nuances do you see in how these two texts teach justice and moral growth?
Well, and we have 2 chapters in the book that focus on sort of looking at, one of them is a pedagogical chapter and one is a sort of more critical chapter, but it can't be emphasized, overemphasized, the importance of having Cassie as a Black kid focalize what's happening. So Scout is a white kid, and her lens is going to, be very different from somebody who's inside of that experience of, being a Black person who is landed, right? Her family owns, has owned 300 acres of land, and when Papa looks out, he says, "Cassie, I want you to look out there. Everything you see belongs to you." She was like, "Oh, but I got brothers." He was like, "We don't divide the Logan land like that. All of that is yours." And so to have a kid who is both, African American, 1930s, family has land, they are not sharecroppers, so they are not beholden in the way that folks who are sharecroppers are, is really important. And yes, Scout is learning, lots of lessons, but she is outside of that experience. And so that unto itself makes those very different texts.
Yeah, I would say Scout, in a sense, is observing those lessons. Like, she doesn't need to know them as Cassie needs to know them. And I just think that Cassie's perspective is that insider perspective, and Scout's kind of like, "Oh, that's interesting." Right? Like, "Oh, I'm a white girl. That's cool that that's happening there." Whereas Cassie's like, "This is something I have to be aware of. I have to know."
What might educators gain by reframing the classic canon through Taylor's lens? I have classic in quotation marks because who defines a classic? Maybe that's another question.
Everything. Yeah, we were talking about this in terms of what we've taught to college students, what I'm presently teaching to specifically 7th graders right now. And in academia, those of us that teach children's literature and library information science, we're actively trying to bring in this idea that there are so many other things out there than classical literature. And it's funny because I think in some ways, Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry might be considered somewhat classical at this point in time. Doesn't mean it necessarily gets taught, but it would be, I think, considered part of the canon. I think we always have to be questioning what the canon is. We owe it to the next generations to make sure that we're not just repeating the same lessons, the same narrow lessons that don't give a full picture of the diversity that exists in our world.
Yeah, and probably most of you are aware that both the teaching profession and the library profession are somewhere between 75 and 80% white still, despite a lot of the efforts that have been made to diversify those professions. And it's really important for us to think about not who's in these teacher education programs and who's in these library and information science programs, but who are they serving once they get into the classroom? I mean, we know that America is becoming, much more diverse. And so our students need to be more conversant with the text that can serve as Rudy and Sims Bishop says, mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. Those mirrors are about books, about people who look or live like you. Windows allow you to see into the life of someone else who doesn't look or live like you. And sliding glass doors are those immersive experiences that sometimes you get a book and you're just like, the whole world goes away. That everybody, Rudy and Sims Bishop, a Black scholar who retired from Ohio State, says everybody needs those experiences. And so if you're not, as an educator, equipped to be able to provide those for all of your students, then that is a bereft education in my opinion. So we think that, there's a place for classics, but I also think that I read all the time so many narratives from my students who say, "Oh, I loved reading until I was in 5th grade, and then it just all went out the window because I was forced to read stuff that wasn't relevant to my life. I didn't, really enjoy it, and so I'm starting to recover that enjoyment now." So why not, if you have to teach, I don't know, Huckleberry Finn, teach it alongside something that is going to be more of a mirror or even a window, more contemporary for kids. And I know we got standards and tests and all that, but if students are not enjoying what they're reading, they're not going to be as eager to read it.
Dr. Martin, you kind of already alluded to this. I'm going to talk about contested space. So I remember I read Roll of Thunder for the first time in 4th grade. So I actually learned about Black land ownership before I learned about sharecropping. And that to me is such a powerful thing. Like I thought that when I would see like Black farmers in literature or portrayed for the longest time, I was like, and they own their land because like that's what Black people do, because that's what the Logans do. Why is, or how is, whichever one you prefer to answer, that portrayal of the Logans as landowners important?
Well, it defines the family. I mean, the first portrayal, you know, when the acquisition of the land happens in the novel called The Land. And if y'all haven't read these books, they're just fantastic. Yeah, and just like the fact that Paul Edward Logan, whose dad was his slave owner and whose mom was one of the enslaved people on his plantation, he just, you know, because his daddy owned land, he just thought, yeah, I deserve to own land. And so that is, he eats, sleeps, and breathes that. And then when he proposes to his wife, Caroline, he says, Caroline, how would you like to plow this, you know, how many ever acres? Maybe it was 300 acres with me, you know? The fact that they were, you know, unified in that and passed that value down, you know, Cassie's 2 generations later, but they know that really defines them. If you don't own your own land, you can't call the shots, you know? And even though they are subject to lots and lots of racism and macroaggressions and, you know, threats of lynching, which happens with TJ, the neighbor next door. They set their cotton fields on fire to keep TJ, a Black boy, from being lynched. So there are lots of ways that that they have challenges, but the fact that Papa in Song of the Trees, when this white man, Mr. Anderson, comes on his land, Papa's working away at the railroad. Stacy rides a horse overnight to go get him. Says, Daddy, somebody's cutting our trees. Papa comes and he sets dynamite in the whole grove of trees. And he said, you know, Mr. Anderson, get off my land. He was like, you crazy. He was like, one thing you got to understand is it don't matter whether I die today or tomorrow, as long as I die right. And so they leave. And he was like, you ain't taking a stick more out of this grove. Leave all the trees where they are. This is my land. Get off. You can't do that if you're a sharecropper, right? And oftentimes, you know, there's one chapter that one of the kids is a sharecropper and he's constantly got a dream that, is it Mo? Dream that they're next year, we're going to be out of debt. But of course, you never get out of debt because that is the way the system is set up when you're a sharecropper. So landowning is huge. It defines the Logan family.
It's the hope of the future, right? It's in our conversation earlier, we were discussing that the land, in a sense, is a family member, and they sacrifice everything just as you would for a family member. Uncle Hammer has to sell his fancy car so the taxes get paid, so they're not going to end up losing the land. The land is everything to them, but it is their hope for the future.
We've already touched on this a bit, but I would love to hear how visibility, like what Taylor provides, is vital for young readers today.
Visibility of
the Logan family.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Taylor is a very slow and deliberate writer. She's been writing children's books for 50 years and produced 10 books. I mean, you know, some of her contemporaries got 100 books out. But I think the deliberateness with which Taylor has crafted this series and the way that she has planted things in Song of the Trees, which was the very first publication, just a very short novella. You could read it in one sitting, that show up in All the Days Past, All the Days to Come. You know, she's a craftswoman in so many ways. And I think, you know, Cassie is a role model, nosy as all get out, but there's a whole lot of things that we wouldn't know if she weren't sitting under the eaves on the porch, listening while Mama and, you know, Big Ma are having conversations. And so, you know, I think that that there are lots of things that Cassie is a character who is really well developed, can provide for contemporary readers of whatever background, to get to know, who she is as a Logan, as kind of one of the, middle child with 3 brothers, who wants to wear the overalls when mama is telling her, you are a teenage girl, you need to put on a skirt to go hunting. She's like, okay, whatever. But, trying to navigate gender, trying to navigate, being a Black child who is so protected that she doesn't understand at first what's happened in Strawberry. How could she get smacked off the sidewalk and her grandma not protect her? And so I think there are, lots of things that we can learn from Cassie. And it's so much of it is just beautifully written, narrative. So
I think too, Cassie's visibility is important in comparison with the other minor characters that are in the book also. You have TJ, who wants to hang out with 2 older white boys, which gets him into a whole lot of trouble because, of course, they frame him for shooting and killing someone trying to steal a gun. And he's there, so he's definitely not innocent, but not, he's the only one who gets in trouble. But even Cassie's comparison with Stacy, her older brother, I think we see, and Mo, and some of the other minor characters who maybe are a little more stereotypical in what we would think of those kids in the 1930s, 1933 in particular. And Cassie is learning her world. And I think the beauty of Taylor's writing is that the reader is learning the world with Cassie. And I don't think it matters if you're reading it as a 4th grader or if you're reading it as an 80-year-old. You learn things as Cassie learns them in some interesting ways, including eavesdropping, and Cassie's kind of always around where she shouldn't be, but that means she's getting the knowledge. I think the reader brings the experience to make that knowledge and experience into wisdom.
What is Afro-pessimism? That was my major question when I read this book, because I was telling Dr. Mielke, I read a lot, so I'm not used to seeing words that I haven't seen before. Now, that doesn't mean I know what they all mean, but I had never seen this one. So can you talk to us a little bit about what Afro-pessimism is and kind of how Taylor's work relates to the concept?
You gonna give it to me? Afro-pessimism is a very pessimistic view that African Americans will always be impacted by slavery and will never be able to escape. So there's a very negative, no hope for the future, no looking forward. And it comes up in a chapter that's actually arguing that Taylor's work serves as a counter narrative in that it is one story about Cassie and her family, but at the same time, it is a larger story. It's multiple narratives sort of fit into one. Of course, there's the danger of the single story, which we've all heard, that you can't just take one story and say, well, that's how it was for everybody because it's one story. But Taylor tries to incorporate her own personal history, the fiction that she's invented through the story of Cassie, to make it a larger picture of life. So it's not just Cassie, it's not just the Logan family. It is offering this glimpse of the world, and multiple stories are included within that, and throughout the series, I would say too.
Yeah, and that, children's literature is in many ways defined by needing to have a sense of hope, because there's so many things that happen to the Logans and around the Logans that could result in a really bleak story if Taylor had chosen to do that. But there is always hope, even in Mississippi Bridge, when this huge rainstorm ends up having a bus that goes off the side of a bridge and into the water, and they're pulling bodies out of the bus and all of that. Even at the end of that story, there is hope. And so I think that's a special talent that children's and to some extent young adult authors have, that there needs to be some hope. So yeah.
I love that answer. Let's talk about the cover art. Roll of Thunder has been published with 3 different covers by 3 different artists. How do those visual choices reflect evolving interpretations of Taylor's work?
Yeah, so this is a fascinating chapter. I wish we'd been able to publish all of the covers in color, but they are in black and white in the book. Wait, no covers. Pink. Okay. At any rate, so Jerry Pinkney, who just died a few years ago, illustrated for 50 years. He's best known for opalescent watercolor. And if anybody's going to Amherst, Massachusetts sometime in the next few months, he has a retrospective at the Eric Carle Museum that I just can't wait. I wrote a piece for the catalog, which I'd never written a museum catalog piece before, but that was fascinating. But Jerry Pinkney was one of the early illustrators of Roll of Thunder. And then Max Ginsberg, who was not Black, also illustrated the cover. And then most recently, for the 40th anniversary of Roll of Thunder, Kadir Nelson, who illustrates the cover of New Yorker, and he's all over the place. He illustrated all the covers. And so just to look at Roll of Thunder, the cover that Max Ginsberg did has Cassie hugging her 2 younger brothers. The cotton is on fire in the background. She's kind of looking over her shoulder, in fear. And so he sort of captures this one moment of Cassie kind of being a protector of her younger brothers. Stacy's not in the picture. The Pinkney cover is, I think Cassie's just looking. They're on the porch, I think. Yeah. So it's sort of it's not focused specifically on Cassie, but it's family on the porch. And then Kadir Nelson chose to have Cassie face front, arms folded, staring straight out at the author, and there's billowing smoke back behind her of the cotton being on fire. And so totally different messaging on those covers. And so, this chapter really talks about, and this is by Ngozi Onora and Sabrina Carnesi, they talk about looking at the dynamics of the illustrations of the covers and how, one, that reflects this sort of time period in which that cover was done, but also the messaging, whether it's a confrontational message or whether it's a message that that invites readers to sort of look empathetically at the characters. So really, a really fascinating chapter, and it's worth, if you read that chapter, just pulling up on Amazon or wherever, looking at those covers as you go through, because they're all beautifully illustrated and just really interesting.
I was just going to say, I think the emotion that is shown on each cover is so incredible, and of course, covers are to sell books, right? And so what is acceptable at the time of the publication, what is trending at the time, what's going to cause those books to move off the shelf, really also says a lot about who we are as a culture at the time that book is being produced.
And there's also moments in that chapter that will make you go, oh, wow, I never thought, look at that, or look at it in that way. Like on the cover of The Land, in one cover, because David has gotten injured, and it doesn't say which leg. So there's one book that has one leg that's disabled, and the other cover has the other leg, and just a position of where they are and all that. So anyway, it's just really interesting to look at, to ask the why behind what you see on the covers.
If you were going to convince this room full of adults to read some of Taylor's work, how would you convince them? What would you say? I mean, just in case this amazing conversation hasn't done it yet, but in a more condensed version.
I do a story time for all the littles in my family. I'm in Seattle, and they're on the East Coast. There's about 15 of them, so I do a story time every Sunday. And then I started doing a women's book club, and I emailed one of my cousins who I just loved when I was a kid. We just lived next door for a while. I said, hey, Wanda, can I send you the book that we're going to read, we're going to read Jacqueline Woodson's Brown Girl Dreaming? She was like, oh, I don't read like that. I was like, wow, okay. audiobook? I mean, I'm like, trying to figure out what could make this so that there's sort of an entry point. So if you need an entry point, Song of the Trees, from which the title of this book kind of hit me in the middle of the head at 2:00 in the morning that it needed to be Song of the Land. But Song of the Trees was the very first one, and it kind of was the gateway for Mildred Taylor. Won an award and basically part of the award was to get it published. And so I would say start with the Song of the Land to see, Song of the Trees, I'm sorry, to see how it strikes you. Because Cassie's voice is, I think, quite well developed there. You get to see David, who is a no-nonsense kind of man. Don't you mess with his land. And so, yeah, start with that one. But Roll of Thunder is usually the entry point for people to get to know the Logans. Is longer, but it's a really good read, I think.
So this is how I sell it to 7th graders. Do you like adventure stories? Do you hate injustice? Do you like to see someone get revenge? Then you need to read Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry.
Oh, sorry. I'm like listening to you guys. I'm supposed
can
to
I-
be asking questions. And I'm like,
Can I just ask, how many people have read any of Taylor's work? Okay, a few of you have. The revenge scene of Cassie getting Ms. Lily Jane back in the woods is one of the best parts of the book ever. Probably one of my favorite parts of any book that I've ever read. That's just, so for those of you that haven't read it, go read it.
there's a quote in the prologue that I wanted to read and kind of discuss a bit because I think it's so important. It says, as long as racism and discrimination exist, Taylor's work will remain relevant. And as I was reading that, my thought, I think you guys have proven through this conversation that even if racism disappeared tomorrow, Taylor's stories are still important because they're bearing witness to an important part of history and an important experience. When you teach your students this book, how do you frame kind of that ongoing struggle against racism or ongoing understanding of racism?
So I'm obviously at this point in my career teaching children. And for most of my students, most of them are white, which means I have to find a way to get them to understand something they haven't experienced yet, for the most part. And what I come back to is actually childhood in some ways is a disempowered position where you need to learn resilience, you need to learn the rules, you need to learn how to overcome those things, and you need to learn how to fight back, persevere, be your genuine self. And so I think Cassie is an example of that throughout the entire series, whether she's, how old is she in Roll of Thunder? I forgot. 8, 9? I think she's 9, to, the very last book where she's a grown adult. Again, she's constantly learning those lessons and learning how to be herself and persevere in a world that doesn't necessarily want her to be herself. I've kind of forgot where I'm going with this answer, but to me, I think, if there isn't, we wish a world where there was no racism, there are still always ways that people are going to work to disempower other people so that they can be in a power position. And so whether it's race, whether it's age, culture, those issues, we all need to know how to be resilient.
And I think for me, right now, there's so many things that are just in the faces of these future librarians that I teach, that all of the books that are being banned right now are Black, brown, and queer. And, helping students understand what intellectual freedom is, what the Library Bill of Rights says about everybody's access to information. Those things are really important for them to know. But one, in terms of what's happening right now, you just need to open the covers, and some things are just, it's like it's happening now. And the fact that history repeats itself, and you recognize patterns so that you can act accordingly to resist oppression. But also, a good story is a good story, and it's not hard to convince students after they read the first chapter or two of one of these books to keep going, because we're human and we all love stories. And I think this story, with its particularities, of being set in Mississippi, of being about Taylor's family, there's so much realism there that even if the kids go to school with animal skins on, even if you don't know anything about some of the sort of things that are sort of time bound, you understand the humanity in Cassie and in her family and the way that they relate to each other. And so it's also just a really good story that will teach some things, that will help kids understand some things, and adults, even if you're not, there for learning anything, right? It's a good story. So,
yeah, the family element in this story is something I always love. Early on in Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, the white school bus has constantly driven by the Logan children as they're walking to school and intentionally splashes mud on them. And one of the younger brothers is very, very particular about his clothing, and it upsets him often. And so the children together decide they are going to dig a ditch in the road so that when the bus drives really fast past them to splash mud, the bus will break its axle, and so they'll disable the bus. And I love, first of all, it works. The plan works. So again, another reason to read the book. It's so good. I just love children like getting revenge on the adult world. It's like so cool. But what I love is that you have 4 siblings who are working together, and they're there for each other throughout the book. And you see that actually in the brothers, the 2 brothers that are left, the older brothers, how Uncle Hammer comes from Chicago and he works to get money for the family. He doesn't even live on the land anymore, and yet that land is such a part of who he is that he does everything he can to help his family that does live on the land keep that land. But it's a family novel. It's a novel of love. It's a novel of revenge. Like I said, I love that. Probably says more about me than anyone else. Sorry. But yeah, there's more to it. Yes, it brings out all of the history, but it is storytelling at its finest.
Obviously, all of the essays and poems in this book are extremely important, and I love the order that they're in. It makes total sense. But if you were going to pick, maybe not in the order, maybe I only have time to read like 2 or 3, what are the ones that really come to the surface as the ones to start with?
I would say Latrice Ferguson's About the Silences is the very first one. Read the poems, of course. And I really love Lauren Rizzuto's story, her chapter that talks about this book as environmental literature. It had never been read in that way, but because the land is so central, she makes an excellent case. She starts with, I speak for the trees have no tongues, and I'm asking you, sir, at the top of my lungs. Dr. Seuss's The Lorax, and she talks about how this is much more environmental literature than, even that. And so those would be my 2.
Yeah. I like the last one, Jennifer Ansbach's Blending Fact and Fiction, All the Days Past, All the Days to Come. That's the last book in the series that Taylor just wrote, a novel of Black resistance. And I think it does a good job of sort of talking about all of the novels. She sort of talks about all the novels from beginning to end, and just you see that pattern of resistance throughout the 3 generations of family that's represented in the series.
All right, before we move to questions, I just want to give a round. Oh, sorry. But before we move to questions, we're going to do a poem.
Homemade love, sower, weaver, receiver, sunken as seeds in good ground, seeding promise, sowing intersectionality, weavers of wonderment, sorrow, joy. Wildflowers and forget-me-nots uncloister in a veil of trees to ne'er forget what crawls out of your soul. Prickles like possum-haw bushes and sweet gumballs, red and bark-limbed by its own deceptive beauty. Playful pines, needle-shaped leaves, royal oak leaf varieties, and majestic maple leaves. Sweet Scytherism whispers and softly sings songs of the trees. This is our land, our piece of heaven to play, plant, and plow, disparate thinking and wondering, ploy, plains and plains of humanity till and disrupt, rows of pride and power and purpose, and familial glory rears and rests in its promise. We be ancestors' prayerful dreams across waters and lands with tucked possessions in loomed hair. Seeds of promise in plain sight, of new life, of new ways, of holding space to nourish souls, spirits, and feed life unto family. Oh yes, with dashes of grace, mercy, and side-eyed stances, daring blossoms and incoherent uncertainties to bloom and crown. You see us.
And that was Rain Parker Washington, who lives in Anderson, South Carolina.
Thank you so much for not letting me skip that. Will you guys please join me in giving these two wonderful ladies a round of applause? There's a few minutes left for questions. If anybody wants to ask, Drew's got the mic.
Yes. One of my very favorite books when I was about 8 was a book called Osceola, War Chief of the Seminoles. It never, and it was written in the 50s, so Lord knows how insensitive it may or may not have been. But it never, as a white child, occurred to me to identify with anybody but Osceola as opposed to the people who were trying to take his land, nor did I think particularly about who was white and who wasn't. Given current discussions about children reading multicultural books, can you say a little more about how white children in fact are responding to these stories and the degree to which they see them as racial or simply about fighting back?
My 7th graders are actually probably right now doing book club in which they're reading Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. I teach in a pretty affluent school. Most are white. I think 98% are white. And I would say that for the most part, I think most of them are Cassie, right? They read through Cassie's eyes. And I think that's the beauty of Taylor's work, is that because Cassie is the focalizer, everything we see is through her eyes. And so we are Cassie. Whether we are white or black, we are Cassie. And so I can't really speak to that experience from a black perspective, but as a white person, I can remember reading that book in probably 6th grade or so and thinking, well, I'm Cassie living in Mississippi and I'm experiencing these things. And again, I think that we as adults forget how disempowering childhood is. And so it's easy to feel that frustration that Cassie feels, the unfairness of the world. I think a white reader reads that as, well, that's a state of childhood. I think a black reader would have an entirely different perspective on that.
Yeah, and I think something that books really help us to do is to put you in positionalities with which you may be familiar, with some aspects of it, and then unfamiliar parts, and makes you stretch. And so I think, there's a lot of value in your having read a Native perspective, even if it was at that time written by somebody who was white, who didn't have that sort of own voices or didn't have the positionality of understanding that from a lived experience. And, you know, there's, yeah, let me just leave it at that. That I do think that the empathy and understanding, well, as what's the, anyway, walking around in another man's shoes from the book we were just talking about, having a senior moment, Mockingbird, you know, that there's real value in putting people in positionalities that they are not familiar with for stretching your mind and your heart.
Did that answer your question? Yeah.
For those of us who are not as familiar with Taylor and the work, can you give us just a condensed like snapshot of who she is, what is the series about, and kind of how they correlate? Just so we kind of understand. It's like, I feel like I want to know, but I don't, but I don't have the synopsis for the movie yet. I'm looking for a deeper synopsis.
Okay. There's only one Taylor movie, by the way. I know that's not your question. It's not.
Don't watch it.
Yeah, it's not a great movie. Don't. Yeah. So basically, the series takes Cassie from 8 or 9 through adulthood, and there's only one book that Taylor wrote that is a Logan book that's not from the perspective of Cassie, and there's one other book that sort of like implies it's the Northern family, the Gold Cadillac. But at any rate, it's really about being a land-owning Black family in Mississippi, starting in the 30s. Actually, the land takes you a generation back, so you get to see how the land was acquired, and it was with the help of a white man whose family sort of generationally supports and are good allies for the Logans. But it's you know, somewhat episodic, that, you know, things happen and then they get resolved, and there's, I think in all of the novels there's a big climax, but it's really about what the conflicts look like through 50, 60, 70 years.
Well, even more if you're thinking about the whole series. So basically you have Paul Edward as the main grandfather figure, who in Cassie's lifetime has passed away. So his son David, and then Cassie and her brothers. So those are the 3 generations.
Yes. Does that help? Okay.
Kind of how they got the land, how they keep the land, what happens when the kids leave, and then Cassie comes back.
And toward the end of the series, the home place dad, David, is ill and dying, and so there's a question about whether the kids who have moved north, you know, northern migration, are going to come back to the land. Cassie does, but what's going to happen, and is the land enough of a draw, even though conditions are still not as good as they are in the north, for the younger family to come back? Oh,
it ends with Obama getting elected. Is that the last, if I'm remembering correctly?
Yeah.
So Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry takes place in 1933. So it's quite a historical span of events too.
And there's a wonderful chapter in here about the one that begins the book, that there's a huge silent gap in between the end of the story and when Obama gets elected. And Ferguson's thing is that that's not a solution, that, you know, Obama doesn't solve racism, basically. Yeah.
Well, thanks to each of you for your explanation. But also, my question is, as far as after doing this working and teaching, what do you feel like that was part of your silence?
Ask that one more time, the last part.
What do you feel, as far as within yourself, feel like there was a silence that perhaps that may have come out within yourselves, as far as teaching and working with others on this?
Well, one thing that is a silence that you will notice is that neither of the 3 of us has a chapter. I wrote the introduction, but we all had chapters. And the university press, well, yes, of course, we did a whole lot of work, but you don't find chapters with our names on them, because the university press said this book could not be 450 pages. Y'all gonna have to give up something. So we wanted the voices of the other authors to come through, the other scholars. So we don't have chapters in there, but you can read our other work elsewhere, dissertations, and for people who like to read dissertations. Yes, Jasmine does, but
I think a silence that I struggle with in this whole series is the book, The Mississippi Bridge, or just Mississippi Bridge, in which it is the focalizer has changed. It's the only book that is not from Cassie's point of view. It's from a minor character named Jeremy Sims. Jeremy Sims comes from an incredibly racist family. His brothers are the ones that are responsible for getting TJ almost lynched. But Jeremy does not fit into that category. Jeremy befriends the Logans and is abused by his father because of it often. He is seen with bruises and basically is told, if you're with the Logans, I'm going to beat you, is what his dad says. And he hides out in the trees for a while, doesn't he? He just basically lives in the forest. And so in that book, what happens is there's a whole group of people who's waiting for the bus, and there are not enough seats for all of the white people to get on the bus. So they ask the black people to get off the bus. It's been raining all day. The bus drives away, ends up going off the bridge, and everyone on the bus is pretty much killed. I feel like there's something to say about the Jeremy Sims that exist. And I haven't yet been able to wrap my head around how to talk about that book in connection with the rest of the Logan series, because I think Taylor's doing something very, very interesting by not writing from the black perspective. And as a white scholar writing about Taylor's work, I kind of feel like there's a reversal going on. And I haven't quite figured it out yet, but I'm going to. It's sitting in there. The silence will get louder and louder until I figure it out.
we figure we'll need a Song of the Land second verse when all these other chapters come out.
Thank you so much for kind of pointing out the works of Mildred Taylor and also kind of the academic research that went into that. What I'm curious about is that is true for Mildred Taylor. Are there other authors that you'd be curious about in terms of researching more, in particular children's and young adult authors that you do not think are celebrated enough in terms of when you're thinking about sliding glass doors and windows and mirrors? That kind of could be looked at in somewhat of the same academic realm, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm going to say Virginia Hamilton, who was the first Black author to win the Newbery Award, which is the big American Library Association award every year. Taylor was the second. And we only have had 5, 6, very few so far, Black authors who have won, and one Native American who's won the Caldecott. So I think definitely because Hamilton tends to be a little bit difficult, a little bit mystical, a little bit, I think she hasn't had as much uptake as I would like to see. Jacqueline Woodson is contemporary fire, just amazing, and she writes picture books all the way up through adult. I think she could definitely use, an anthology, some more attention. Yeah, those would be my 2 top picks.
Yeah, I would add Mallory Blackman, who's actually a Black British author, who likes to take American history and British history and combined it in some really interesting, fascinating ways. And she plays a lot with power. But so I've taught Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry to college classes in England, alongside with Mallory Blackman's work, Noughts and Crosses. And it was interesting to see what history the British audience picked up. And I think it'd be fascinating for an American audience to then read about the Black British experience, IRA bombings and things like that. And so I think her work is really kind of fascinating also.
Thank you. That brilliant exposition. I've learned a whole lot about Mildred Taylor's work. Thanks a lot. I'm just wondering, because my understanding is that after her academic studies, she chose to serve in the Peace Corps, and she went to Ethiopia. And I'm wondering if I think she spent 2 years in Ethiopia. And I'm wondering if you have any idea of what were her impressions about East Africa, Ethiopia, after she came back, or if any of her work is reflected in her trip to Ethiopia.
I would say my understanding of what I've read, and it's been a while since I've sort of gone through the biography, but is I think that her trip to, and her parents were dead set against her going. One, because she was a woman going somewhere by herself. They did not like that. They really tried to convince her not to go, and she was like, I'm going to do this. I think it gave her a sense of independence, but I think it also contributed strongly to her coming back and becoming an activist in the civil rights movement. I think she saw, the potential for Black empowerment while she was in Ethiopia, and I think it also probably contributed to her. I think she taught. Did she do some teaching while she was there? Yeah, I think it contributed to what the series became, because she realized, how much children need to know their history and their background. So I think those are two things that were pretty concrete and drew a pretty quick line or straight line from that time in the Peace Corps and then what she did when she came back.
I would just say that Mildred Taylor herself is a very private person. We reached out numerous times through all of the connections that we possibly could to get her to give some thoughts about the book, or even to try to interview her. She's just a very private person. So there's a lot of things, her personal history we can gather from acceptance speeches that she's done and things like that. But for the most part, she's really private about those sorts of things. And so we can kind of see her history in some of the things she writes. But yeah, those would be great questions. I'd love to ask her that.
Yeah, even she won the Legacy Award a few years ago, which used to be called the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award, but it's a Lifetime Achievement Award that the American Library Association gives. So very few people have won that. She didn't even come out for that. She sent her acceptance speech. So she is private and she does not come out for stuff. So yeah.
Well, thank you guys so much, Jasmine, Tammy, and Michelle. Let's give them a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. In just a few moments, we'll have copies of Song of the Land available for purchase and signing just to the left of the stage. But if you're looking to find an entrance point and some connection to also what we have coming up next for History is Lunch, the land centers around the beginning of this Reconstruction story. And next week, we have the benefit of having Jerry Mitchell come and share his latest work, Reconstruction in Mississippi. And so if you're looking for a starting point, it's a great place to go. It's my favorite of them. You have to start somewhere, how they get the land. And so it's an excellent book to start. But once again, let's give a round of applause to Jasmine, Tammy, and Michelle. We hope you'll come back again next week and join us again for Jerry Mitchell's Reconstruction in Mississippi. Y'all have a wonderful rest of the week. Thank y'all for being with us.